Welcome to day number 43. We're looking at 2 Thessalonians chapters 2 and 3. And Peter, again, these letters, they're actually letters that Paul wrote, are getting kind of shorter and shorter as we go. But in this one, we discover that the Apostle Paul, again, is talking about the end of all things. And we dealt with that in the first book of letter to Thessalonians. Now we're dealing with it again. And I think when we think about the day of the Lord, and I referenced this last time, when I was a young boy, there was a trilogy of movies that were out there that were all about kind of inciting fear in youth in order for us to live right, so that we wouldn't get on the backside of God's, backhand and judgment. And yet that's not really what the day of the Lord is for those who are of Jewish mindset, Jewish faith, the Older Testament, that the day of the Lord is actually something they prayed for, they longed for, and they looked forward to, because God would make all things right. So Paul is utilizing that very differently than how it was utilized in my life. So what are your thoughts on the day of the Lord? I know we talked about it recently, but we think it's important to visit this again.
Yeah, no, the theologian whose work was kind of like the first big waking up to theology for me was a German theologian named Moltmann, who he and I ended up meeting for an afternoon in Germany. And
he was an amazing man.
I said...
you know what surprised me about him, can I interject something? Yeah. Was here's this man who is a world-famous theologian, and Peter, you wrote him a letter when you came to faith reading the book, The Crucified God. You wrote him a letter. This man does not do emails, right? So you had found that out. You wrote him a letter, right? And he wrote you a letter back. Their little pen pal relationship. He agreed to receive us when we were in Germany. I was there training some pastors and working with some churches, and you came along. But what struck me was sitting in his living room in Germany, how pastoral he was.
Yeah.
Right? That really stunned me. I've been around quite a few theologians, but this guy was so pastoral. And you remember what he said to you about your career and what he would recommend that you would do for a period of time?
Yeah. So Moltmann had been raised really far from any sense of Christian faith and found Christian faith as a prisoner of war in Scotland. He had fought for Germany in World War II and was captured. And so he spent his life bouncing back and forth between pastoral ministry and academic theology, and has said, I could never pick between being a pastor and a theologian, he said. And so I was kind of like, what should I do with my life, prophet? Anything you tell me to do. Yeah. And he said, between your undergrad, your master's, or your master's and your PhD, you have to spend like 2 or 3 years in a parish and learn the real questions of real people instead of the artificial questions of academics, and then write your dissertation for them.
Sure.
And so...
Which that's mind-blowing if you think about it.
It's Moltmann was such a great example, and is Pauline in this way, of somebody who thought that when you talk about theology to people who aren't theological specialists, it's no good losing people and just talking yourself off into the trees.
Right, the ivory tower thing is what it's often phrased as.
It's not as though there's any part of Christian faith that doesn't matter.
Right.
And so when Moltmann, in the he got really famous, this guy named Karl Barth, in 1919, for writing an important book on the important commentary on the Epistle to the Romans. And Barth, this theologian Karl Barth, we think is the greatest theologian of the 20th century, and we'll read him for 1,000 years. And Pius X said that he was the most important theologian since Thomas Aquinas.
Right.
So when you've got a Catholic pope saying that a Reformed theologian is the most important, you're doing something right. And Barth's career was winding down in the 60s. He died in 68, I think. And people are like, well, what are we going to do now? He said everything. He wrote this 10,000-page, 14-volume book called The Church Dogmatics. And Moltmann was part of a duo of theologians, another named Wolfhard Pannenberg. And they said, well, one of the things Barth has missed is that future hope gives shape to everything Christians do and think. And so they got called the Theology of Hope movement,
Yes.
based around a book Moltmann had written called Theology of Hope. And so when we sat down...
Which ties into what we're talking
Yeah.
about with the eschaton in a big way.
Because when I sat down with Moltmann and said, some people read you as a universalist. And universalism is the belief that...
all gods lead to the same thing.
Well, no, the universalism specifically the belief that all people go to heaven.
Oh, that's right. My bad.
And
You're
there's...
Yep.
That's different.
Then all gods go to the same.
And it's also different than no one goes to hell, which sounds a little like splitting hairs, but everyone goes to heaven. Because Moltmann's career has been about announcing the importance and the comprehensiveness of what God's going to do at the end of the world based on what we know from what God's done in Jesus. So I said, some people read you as a universalist. Do you think that's fair? And in a really thick German accent that'll get boring pretty quickly, Moltmann said, well, go back and read the Psalms where the trees clap their hands and the mountains shout for joy at God's judgment.
Yeah, yeah.
And at the end of Corinthians, Paul tells us that every bird has its reflection in the glory of God.
Yeah.
And Moltmann's theology has tapped into this idea that what's going to happen at the end of the world is not good people go to heaven, bad people go to hell.
Yeah.
It's not Christians go to heaven, non-Christians go to hell. It's heaven is going to come to earth, to the physical earth, and that this world is going to get resurrected like how Jesus got resurrected. And it's not like physical earth is going to get evacuated and we're going to get sorted into categories.
Right.
It's that God is going to bring the reality of God's rule and reign, which we sometimes call heaven, onto earth and set things right and defeat death. And so all the allies of death will die, and all the enemies of death and the allies of God will be raised to life.
Right.
And so Moltmann sees in that vision such... Because sometimes heaven and that kind of...
It's very distant.
That trilogy thing.
Yeah.
It's sort of like it feels like the carrot.
It does.
You're sort of being like, if you're good, you'll get that eventually.
Right.
But what Moltmann thinks is actually going on is a motivating reality that has already started in Jesus' resurrection, and a vision of what the world could be like. And isn't that how we want to participate in it now? And also, wouldn't it be great if how we're trying to make the world, God's world now, will happen like forever? And that's so close to what Paul is saying.
Well, he took it from Paul in many ways.
Yeah, there's a lot of hair splitting about how Germans decide to say things and ancient Jews decide to say things. But this idea that hope is central to how Christians live and central to what we believe is something that people had lost for a long time. And so biblical scholars started to find it again in Paul, and Moltmann started to bring it back into theology, and now it's a big part of the agenda.
Right. Well, and not only that, we see it in Paul, and it shows up again in Second Thessalonians again, where Paul is calling people to this hope of the eschaton, that the day of the Lord is coming and all things would be made new. Peter, as we kind of move towards closing, one of the things that struck me about Jürgen Moltmann that I'll never forget was while we were sitting in his living room, his wife was actually very ill, if not passing away upstairs. Now, she ended up living for quite a while past our visit, but what really struck me was how he would slip out and go tend to her, and then he would slip back down again to sit and talk with you. And again, just that pastoral sense of things that he had. But one of the things that struck me, and I think it comes straight out of his theology, and this is why theology is so important, was how much hope he had for you. Because he believes that God is intricately involved in the world, is going to bring the world to this amazing place where heaven and earth will come together. That's where our hope lies. It pulls us, it calls us, it affects us now. And just how he was pastoring you was built out of this deep-seated belief of what Paul's doing in 2 Thessalonians, of calling people to allow that future reality to give them hope now and to pull them towards Christ's likeness. And I saw that really play out between you and him, and there must be 70 years between the two of you or something like that.
There is about.
there's a lot of span of time, but that was an amazing visit. So, Peter, one final thought. Do you have any final thoughts before we exit our time together? Or?
Yeah, well, in Paul's day, there was this big debate, which was, how do you know if you are part of the righteous people of God?
Yes.
That's really working to really do what God... And when Paul comes to the other side of believing that Jesus is the Messiah of Israel, and as he's reworking his Pharisee theology to now be refit to worship Jesus as the Messiah, one of the things he comes around to is, and this is what all of Galatians was about, was you know that you are part of God's people, that you're on this side of God's eschaton, if you believe in Jesus.
Yes.
That's it.
Yes.
So faith in Jesus for Paul becomes the righteousness that marked out the Jewish martyrs whom God was waiting to resurrect and to vindicate.
Yes.
Now it's faith in the martyr Jesus, who God has already resurrected and vindicated. And if you trust him for your life, God will give you the Spirit, and at the end of all things, God will raise you to life in him too. And so I think sometimes people hear this and they immediately go to, what do I need to do, or what do I need to stop doing? And the answer is, our faith is really just held in the fact that we believe in Jesus for our lives.
Yes. Well, in closing, I'm going to read the the final reading from 2 Thessalonians, because I think it's a great way to close. Here's what Paul writes. Now may the Lord of peace himself give you peace at all times and in every way. The Lord be with all of you. God bless you, and we look forward to seeing you in tomorrow's video.